Welcome back, everyone, to Self Principle. As always, I'm Dr. Sean Hashmi, board certified nephrologist and obesity medicine specialist. And today we're going to take a deep dive into specifically the nutrition for kidney health. Now, this is the latest updated version of the lecture that I give every single year. So I wanted to make sure all of you get to hear all of the latest cutting edge research as far as the field of nutrition specifically for kidney disease is covered. So now we're going to talk about a few different things today. We're going to talk about the key nutrients: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, protein, fats, fiber. And we're also going to touch upon sugar and artificial sweeteners, which is something people don't think about. Then I want to make sure you have an understanding of what is the optimal diet when it comes to kidney disease. And finally, at each section, I want to make sure you walk away with very key practical tools that you can start using in your home, your loved one's life right now. So, some of the basics. What we know about this silent epidemic is that 90% of the people who have chronic kidney disease don't even know they have it. And we've talked about this before. It ends up affecting over 37 million Americans. And there are 800,000 plus people who are living with kidney failure. And what are the main causes? We've talked about this repeatedly, and those are diabetes, high blood pressure, and weight. Now, I can't stress this enough because if you're dealing with excess weight, you want to make sure you're checking your blood pressure and making sure you're not a pre-diabetic or a diabetic. Now, what are some high-risk groups to be aware of? Well, it turns out that 1 in 3 with diabetes and 1 in 5 with hypertension are likely to develop kidney disease. And what happens is kidney disease turns out, and it's still true to today, that it's more deadly than breast or prostate cancer annually. So the first and most important ingredient is really sodium or salt. And the target is around 2 grams of sodium daily. That's roughly about 1 teaspoon of salt. And what does it do? Well, it will end up lowering your blood pressure if you cut down the salt less than 2 grams by about 8 to 10 points. That's massive because when you look at what a blood pressure medication can do, that's about the same number. And in addition to lowering that blood pressure, just by cutting your sodium or salt, you're going to see that there's a significant reduction in protein in the urine. So what does all of that mean? Well, it means that you're going to slow the long-term damage to your kidney and prevent the risk of dialysis. Now, more important than that, what you're really doing is you're decreasing the pressure or the intraglomerular pressure on the kidney. And if you're on blood pressure medications or kidney protective medications, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, MRAs, or mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, or SGLT2 inhibitors, any one of those, if you do a low sodium diet, it will magnify the effects of that. How much more? Well, it turns out that if you cut back on salt, you can get 40 to 50% greater protein reduction than just doing medications by itself. So diet and lifestyle are critical when it comes to talking about protecting your kidneys. Now, how does all of this work? Well, if you cut back on salt, you actually reduce the fluid volume, and this actually makes medications more effective. In other words, you're taking the pressure off the kidneys. And if you have issues where you really can't get medications to the highest dose, for example, because of side effects or so forth, well, putting in lifestyle, specifically cutting back on sodium, could be a secret weapon. And how significant is this? There are studies that show that protein in the urine drops from as much as 1.68 grams, that's 1,680 milligrams, down to 0.85 grams per day simply by doing the medications and adding on a low sodium diet. So where the heck does this tricky sodium hide? Well, it turns out the main source is really packaged and restaurant foods. It is not the salt shaker. In fact, 70% comes from packaged and restaurant foods. So when you're looking at labels, remember, try to look for quote unquote low sodium. What does that mean? You're looking for 140 milligrams or less per serving. And the things that more often than not get us into trouble are things like bread, canned soups, deli meats, restaurant meats. Those are the big offenders. So if you're starting out this journey, what I recommend is simply start with 2 high sodium foods per week and switch them with some fresh alternatives. Now, let's switch gears to potassium. Potassium actually serves a very critical role in the body. It's needed for your nerve function, for muscle function, and for blood pressure regulation. Now, for most folks, general population speaking, about 3,500 to 4,700 milligrams per day is really good in terms of heart health. But when we start to get into chronic kidney disease in the early stages, it's usually safe to follow the normal targets, but really you want to check the blood test. And as you get into advanced chronic kidney disease, what I recommend is to make sure that you individualize how much potassium you take based on labs and what medications you're taking in other words, if your potassium is okay and you like eating bananas and they're not causing it to go up, there is no need for you to stop eating the bananas. You can definitely have them. But this is why working with your doctor and your team to check blood test levels is so critical. And remember, there is all sorts of benefits to potassium, blood pressure, heart benefits, but too much or too little ends up being a bad thing. So when it comes to blood pressure, how much of an impact? Well, according to studies, you can see your systolic blood pressure drop by about 4 points and your diastolic blood pressure drop by about 2 points. Now, remember, once again, what you want to know is you want to be able to eat what you want as far as potassium goes only if your blood tests show that it's stable. Because high potassium or hyperkalemia can stop the heart, it can cause arrhythmias, and we can't pull you out of it. So we want to prevent it in the first place. Now, when it comes to diet quality, what we talk about is a plant-forward diet, rich in fruits, vegetables, and this can definitely be safe in an advanced CKD patient as long as we have regular lab monitoring. One thing that most of my patients always miss is salt substitutes. Oftentimes, salt substitutes have potassium. So remember, make sure you read the label. Don't use potassium chloride-based salt substitutes, especially one, if you have a history of high potassium, or two, if you're on medications that can raise your potassium. The prils, lisinopril, enalapril, also known as ACE inhibitors, or the ARBs like losartan, candesartan, or the mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists like spironolactone, finerenone. So those are just basics. But the other stuff you want to know is that on the flip side, potassium actually has some really amazing benefits. What the data shows is that if you go up by 1 gram per day on potassium, you're actually linking that to about an 11% lower risk of stroke and improved blood pressure. That's a gram per day. Remember, the overall limit is really based on what your potassium is like. What's the safe range? You're aiming for about 3.5 to 5 millimoles per liter. So if you look at your blood test, you look at the potassium, you want to be between 3.5 to 5. And one thing that most patients and doctors forget is if you make any medication changes, any meds that affect potassium, RAS inhibitors, MRAs, diuretics, so things like lisinopril, losartan, spironolactone, finerenone, if you change any of those, or you change the diuretics, Lasix, Bumex, torsemide, you want to check a blood test in 1 to 2 weeks to ensure that the potassium level is still good, meaning you didn't make it too high, or with diuretics, you didn't make it too low. And remember, other things like SGLT2 inhibitors, things like Jardiance or empagliflozin, that, and of course, loop diuretics, Lasix, etc., they can drop your potassium. And so therefore, you want to be aware that those are medications to watch out for. Same thing with spironolactone, finerenone. Now, what are some practical tips you want to know? Well, remember, the lower potassium choices are things like apples, berries. I love berries. Grapes, pineapples, lettuce, cucumber, cauliflower. But even those people who love certain foods, like I love bananas. So you can swap a cup of, or one banana essentially, for a cup of berries, and you can have a significant reduction in how much potassium you're giving. Same thing with like tomato sauce. You could replace tomato sauce with roasted red peppers, for example. But what's really neat is if you soak or you end up boiling potatoes, you can actually reduce potassium by as much as 50%. So, bottom line here is boiling can help, soaking can help, s- simple, basic swaps can help. And if you do those things, you'll find that you can eat foods you like and keep your potassiums safe. Now, let's jump into calcium. Calcium is important because it's needed for all sorts of things, your bones, your health, as far as blood vessels goes, in terms of neuromuscular signaling. But what happens is with kidney disease, you start to get a disruption in the calcium phosphate parathyroid, which is a gland right here next to your neck. So you get a disturbance in all of those things. And as that starts to happen, it actually increases the risk for bone disease and for vascular calcification, essentially calcifying all your blood vessels. So some basic tips are: one, eating foods rich in calcium is always better and safer for your body. You want to try to avoid large supplemental calcium. In other words, those calcium supplements you get over the counter, because if you take too much at once, that positive calcium balance, meaning too much calcium in the blood, it has to go somewhere. And where does it go? Well, it ends up accelerating the calcification inside your blood vessels. So the goal really is we want a neutral balance, and we really want to avoid getting calcium levels too high. All right, so what does that mean practically? Well, the optimal intake is about 800 to 1000 milligram per day. And once again, my preference is you try to achieve this through food and only supplement if you can. What's considered high? Well, high is greater than 2 grams or 2000 milligrams per day. And this is usually achieved through supplements. And why is it a concern? Once again, can increase vascular calcification. And then finally, the thing that you want to always remember is that try to really, really be mindful of eating whole foods and reducing what external supplements you might be taking. So, if you are somebody who has advanced chronic kidney disease and your doctor says you need to take binders to control your phosphorus, remember, try to see if you can get non calcium based binders so that you're not overloading the body with calcium. Those are things like sevelamer, for example, and there's many new ones on the market. And then when it comes to tracking, it's always important. Check your blood test. Those things are the most important things. In chronic kidney disease, I have a running joke where I say, look, I don't even need to see my patients. Their blood tests can literally tell me everything about them. And that's why it's so key to stay on top of those blood tests. So, calcium's cousin is phosphorus. Phosphorus is very important for bones, for teeth, for cell membranes, even for energy or ATP. But what you want to know is as kidneys get worse, you can't get rid of phosphorus. So, what does that mean? You get a condition where there's hyperphosphatemia, too much phosphorus. It activates the parathyroid gland. It's para means next to the thyroid, has nothing to do with the thyroid. It's just next to it. And so the end result of all of this is you get these bone and mineral disorders. And what that means is you can either get something called brittle bones, where the bones snap and break easily, or you can have the opposite, where it's too low and you can have adynamic bone disease or soft bone disease. So when we talk about phosphorus, the natural sources of phosphorus are things like meats, dairy, beans, and those have moderate amount of absorption. But food additives, in other words, your ultra processed foods, the phosphorus in them is highly absorbable. And this is the main culprit when it comes to high serum phosphate levels. So, what do you really want to understand? Well, what ends up happening is the more phosphorus in the blood, the higher the risk of death. In fact, there's an 18% higher risk of death per 1 point increase in phosphorus levels. And why is this the case? Well, because there's less excretion in kidney disease, parathyroid goes up, FGF23 goes up, you have all this calcification of the blood vessels, so your risk of heart attack, stroke significantly increases. And how do we correct it? Well, remember, first is we want to correct it through fixing what we eat. And if that's not enough, then yeah, let's switch over to binders if that's what we need to do. Now, when it comes to phosphorus absorption, I touched on it a little bit a second ago, but let me just give you some key numbers here. When it comes to processed foods, that phosphorus is absorbed about 100%, formerly 80 to 100%. But when you get to animal-based phosphorus, meat, even dairy, that's about 40 to 60% absorbed. Then if you switch gears and you go to plants, you'll see that because plant phosphorus is bound to phytate, only about 10 to 30% gets absorbed. And that's why it's the best choice we have. So what's the idea? In your eating, we want to focus on minimally processed, plant-forward products, including plant-forward proteins. And if you're thinking about this, remember, there are all sorts of hidden phosphorus additives around. For example, deli meats, hot dogs, processed cheese slices, colas, instant mixes. And so when you're looking at the labels, drop down to where the ingredients are and look for things that have a PHOS or PHOS in them. For example, sodium phosphate, hexametaphosphate. There's all sorts of names like that, and you need to be careful. But practically, think about making some swaps. If you like deli turkey, switch it over to home roasted chicken. If you like processed cheese, get additive-free dairy or alternatives. Instant mixes, switch them for dry cooked beans, whole foods. Just keep in mind that our goal is to choose fresh, minimally processed food because not only is it good for your heart, lungs, brain, kidneys, everything, it also lowers the phosphorus burden and reduces your risk of death. So, practical guidelines. Diet is first. Limit processed foods. So the deli meats, the colas, the processed cheese. Okay? Number 2, pick better proteins, plant-based sources whenever possible. Phosphorus binders, if you can, try to use non-calcium types if the levels are high, and take those with meals. And finally, look for the PHOS. Scan the ingredient list and see if you can find it. So the challenge I have for all of you this week is try to see if you can have one processed meat swap this week to build sustainable habits. I don't need you to go 100% convert to vegan, none of that. It's all about making small, measurable, manageable changes. Then let's get into magnesium. Magnesium is fascinating. It supports energy, muscle, nerve function, blood pressure, and it's also very important for insulin sensitivity, something most people don't think about. And when it comes to chronic kidney disease, low magnesium levels, they will lead to endothelial dysfunction. That means your blood vessels, the lining of your blood vessels, it doesn't move as well. And this results in higher risk of heart attacks, stroke, in other words, higher risk of cardiovascular death. Now, the flip side is high magnesium. Keep in mind, the risk of hypermagnesemia is still very low, but it does go up as the kidney function declines. So why do you care about magnesium? Because it may help in reversing some of the vascular calcification that's occurring. And what you want to do is the same thing. Monitor your blood levels. Now, if you're somebody who takes laxatives or antacids, be careful because some of them contain a large amount of magnesium. And if you have advanced chronic kidney disease, that could lead you to the state of hypermagnesemia. Now, what's the evidence in CKD? Once again, low mag levels, endothelial dysfunction, insulin resistance, and higher cardiovascular risk. And repletion also, by the way, can actually help blood pressure a little bit. So we said lowering sodium, more potassium, more magnesium, all three of those help blood pressure. And the stuff you want to know is make sure you're avoiding any laxatives, antacids, and so forth. But most importantly, how the heck do you get magnesium? Well, look at seeds, look at nuts, leafy greens, legumes, whole grains. These are some basic, excellent sources. And if you notice, they're predominantly plant based. And so, same thing, anytime you have a deficiency, take a look at your diet. Is there stuff you could be eating to correct it? And if so, do that first. Now, let's shift gears into protein because this gets really tricky. So, when we have protein intake, what the data shows is that 0.6 to 0.8 grams per kilogram per day has been shown to slow down the rate of chronic kidney disease progression. And if you're going to do that, make sure you're getting at least 30 to 35 kilocalories or calories per kilogram per day so that you don't get into a state of malnutrition. So, what do you want to do? Well, quality matters. Switch to plant predominant proteins because they have a lower acid load. And of course, they're going to have lower phosphorus absorption. But if you end up doing red meat, just know that the more red meat you eat, the faster the chronic kidney disease will progress and the higher the likelihood of going to end-stage renal disease. And this has to do with the acid load, the heme iron, more uremic toxins being made. So if you're somebody, look, I get it. You like red meat, you're not ready to quit. Maybe start with replacing one serving with fish, poultry, eggs, or legumes. And it doesn't have to be daily. It could be something you say, look, I'm going to cut down red meat to, once or twice a week. Instead of having it every day, I'm going to cut it back to every other day. Doesn't matter what the choice is. You got to take that first step. Don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. All right. What are the protein sources that you want to know about? Once again, plant-rich diets, they have a 20% lower protein spilling in the urine. Protein spilling in the urine is the best marker for how fast your kidneys will decline. You flip that around to red meat, and red meat has about a 40% higher risk of kidney failure, and animal fat and more than 2 servings a week of red meat, they're shown to increase protein spillage in cross-sectional studies. Now, yes, cross-sectional studies can have issues with them, I understand, but still, there's so much data to show more red meat, more protein spillage. And so once again, what's the dietary pattern? Plant predominant, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy, all of those, they show a protective benefit. Now, some people always ask me on the channel, well, what about the very low protein diets and keto analogs? That's about 0.3 grams per kilogram per day. And they give you keto acids or essential amino acid supplements. But this is very, very tricky and very difficult to do and very hard to sustain. So the data, yeah, it can delay dialysis if you are under close supervision. But you want to understand that you need a really motivated patient and you're going to need very close follow-up to make sure this works. So the goal there is you're trying to maintain, once again, 30 to 35 calories per kilogram per day to prevent malnutrition. You're favoring plant predominant, and you got to have very close follow-up, checking weight, albumin, labs, and of course, you're going to need a qualified renal dietitian on this. So when we talk about the gut-kidney axis, what you want to know is the more red meat and animal proteins you eat, the more they produce uremic toxins inside the body. So what ends up happening is you have a higher production of things like indoxyl sulfate, p-cresyl sulfate. And what do? They cause oxidative stress. They cause inflammation. They damage your blood vessels. The more toxins you produce, the more damage to your blood vessels, the faster the kidneys die. In fact, higher toxin levels, what ends up happening is we see both kidneys failing fast and the risk of death going higher. But if you switch to plant-predominant diets and fiber, you will find that the toxin production can go down by 20 to 30% in studies. And if you start to do fiber, which is prebiotic fibers like inulin, starch, you'll find that indoxyl sulfate goes down by about 20% in just a matter of 2 to 3 months. So let's switch to fats because there's so much controversy, but in kidney disease, the data still is very strong and very clear. Saturated fat, if you take it, you will find that the risk of protein in the urine goes up. How much? As much as 33% if you're getting more than 13% versus less than 10%. And so once again, more saturated fat, spilling more protein, faster the kidney dies. So what should you do? Switch out the saturated fats with things like mono and polyunsaturated fats. So MUFAs and PHOS. So olive oil, for example. And you're going to lower both chronic kidney disease and cardiovascular risk. And so what are our preferred sources for fats? Well, olive oil, olives, avocado oil, avocados, nuts and seeds, and of course, fatty fish. And this goes without saying, but you must avoid trans fats. Trans fats, even today, are still around, and they can be hidden in packaged food. But remember, they have a very strong link to inflammation, to cardiovascular disease, to chronic kidney disease. Now, fiber. What's important to note about fiber? Well, it turns out that folks who are getting the highest intake in this study was 33.5 grams per day versus lowest, which was about 13.6 grams per day. Higher fiber, they had a 53% reduction in chronic kidney disease incidence. And for every additional 5 grams of fiber per day, had about an 11% reduced chronic kidney disease risk. And this is something that we can all do, is eat more fiber. So once again, from a mortality perspective, just 10 grams of fiber per day extra reduces your risk of all-cause mortality, dying from anything, across chronic kidney diseases by 19%. And what's the reason? You improve your blood sugars, you improve cholesterol, you improve inflammation, and you alter the gut microbiome so you're making less of those uremic toxins. So, practical tips you want to take home: you're targeting 25 to 30 grams per day of fiber. Sources of fiber that are excellent: legumes, vegetables, berries, oats, whole grains. Remember, I love berries. I think berries are awesome. Supplements, if you're going to do it, psyllium or inulin if you can't get enough from the diet. But the thing you got to know about fiber, if you increase your fiber too fast, you will be so constipated. You have to go very, very slowly as you increase your fiber so your GI tract can adapt to it. So remember that. Number 2 is, as you increase more fiber foods, make sure your nephrologist, your kidney team knows it so they can check your blood tests, especially for things like potassium. All right, sugars. Sugars and artificial sweeteners, both of them are bad for you. When it comes to sugar-sweetened beverages, what the data shows is there's about a 19% higher risk of chronic kidney disease. And if you're talking about things like artificially sweetened beverages, if you have more than 1 serving a day, there's about a 26% higher chronic kidney disease risk. And for folks who are doing diet sodas, more than 7 glasses per week versus less than 1 per week, there's a whopping 83% higher risk of going on dialysis. And why is this the case? Well, alternative sweeteners, just like sugar, they will cause insulin resistance. Your uric acid will go up and you will produce more fat. And that fat will get stored and clog up all sorts of parts of your body. Now, people always think, well, I take stevia or monk fruit, it's natural, it can't be that bad. It is. So here's the interesting part about this. So we're using sugar as a reference as one-time sweetness. Well, stevia is about 200 to 300 times sweeter. Sucralose is 600 times sweeter. That's Splenda. Monk fruit is 100 to 250 times. Aspartame, about 200 times. Saccharin is 300 to 500 times. And so the reason this is important is when you're taking this stuff and you eat a strawberry will never taste as sweet because your taste buds are used to a level of sweetness that is so much higher. Now there's things like sugar alcohols, things like allulose, which is less sweet than sugar, erythritol, xylitol, maltitol. These are all less sweet than sugar, but they also have their own side effects that can occur. But just keep in mind, the more alternative or artificial sweeteners you have, the higher the risk of chronic kidney disease, as much as 25 to 30%. So, what are strategies? Well, start with the liquids. Replace the sodas, replace the juices with water, seltzer, or unsweetened tea. Remember, what I tell my patients who come to see me for weight loss is we say the only liquids you should have is water, coffee, and tea. Water, coffee, and tea. And then when it comes to cravings, and I know I get it, a lot of us have cravings. I have cravings too. If you have cravings, remember, try to pair a sweet food with something that has fiber and or protein, because that will give you that sense of fullness and help you exercise better self-control. And of course, moderate use is always good, but you have to know yourself. For some people, moderation works perfectly. Others, they just can't have one. And they start with one, and next thing you know, it's completely gone out of proportion. Now, for diets, it's important to understand what is the data. Well, it turns out that all of these diets, Mediterranean, DASH, plant-based, they all have whole foods as their foundation. So plant-forward diets like Mediterranean show about a 14 to 23% lower chronic kidney disease. With DASH, there's about a 16% lower chronic kidney disease incidence or new occurrence. And DASH also lowers blood pressure by about 5 to 6 points. That's like half of a blood pressure medication every day. But once again, if you're going to do this, you need your nephrologist, your dietitian to stay on top of it. You got to make sure your kidney doctor is checking your blood test on a regular basis. One of my favorite diets, which is the plant-dominant low-protein diet, or what we call PLADO, plant-dominant PLADO. The definition is, once again, 0.6 to 0.8 grams per kilogram per day of protein, with more than half from plants. So you have less acid, you have less phosphorus going in your body, and you're meeting the protein requirements. And at the same time, what we find is that when it comes to dialysis or losing more than 50% of your kidney function, you'll find that on a low protein diet, especially plant dominant, you can lower that risk by as much as 70%. Now, it does take some menu planning, but once again, with the National Kidney Foundation, there's so many new sites. And of course, our site, selfprinciple.org, is going to have all sorts of meal planning and handouts and everything coming real soon. But you have so many resources to be able to tap into to help with meal planning. Then, of course, people always say, well, what about a low carb or ketogenic approach? I know somebody who lost fill in the blank number of pounds with a low carb diet. So yes, there is absolutely short-term evidence that you'll get weight loss, you'll get improved diabetes without immediate kidney harm. The thing about that is when we get into what the mechanisms are, there's more acid load, there's more cholesterol, they can be kidney stones. Now the new data shows that you can develop fatty liver with it. So in other words, in the long run, there's actually more inflammation, more pressure on the kidneys to function. And that's why I don't recommend doing a low carb or keto diet in kidney disease. And then just stepping back and talking about this concept of acid. If you have high acid load, that's usually a more animal-based diet. And so this will lead to faster chronic kidney disease. Now, what does the data show? Well, when we give patients baking soda or oral bicarbonate, it actually slows down the decline in kidney function. Instead of almost 6 points, they'll slow it down to about 2 points over 2 years in some of this data. But what's fascinating here is a pill, sodium bicarbonate, can do this, but so can fruit and vegetables. Fruit and vegetables also slow the progression, the same as sodium bicarbonate. So if you're looking at this, what's easier, taking a pill forever or just eating more whole foods? And the answer is eating more whole foods. And for those of you guys who are wondering, well, what should my bicarb be? 22 to 26 is the best range to be. And start with diet. Now, some patients, despite diet, we do need sodium bicarbonate. But don't forget, the sodium can affect the blood pressure and the volume, so we need to be very, very mindful. Now, What are the key takeaways from all of this talk that we did today? First, you've got to understand this. Food has so much power. If you make better choices, you can protect your kidneys and protect your heart, your lungs. Think about it this way. I have two daughters, and right now they're 8 and 12, and Faith and Celine. And the thing about both of them is I want to be around to watch the moments in their life. That's the greatest joy. We're all going to leave this place sooner or later. And while we're here, it's all about the memories and your legacy and your foundation. And for me, it's about watching my two wonderful daughters grow up. And to do that, I have to eat better. Do I mess up? 100%. I make lots of mistakes. But the other part of this is quality. Try to make better choices, higher fiber, more plants. Really, the goal is whole food, because if you do that, the sodium, the phosphorus, the processed foods, the excess sugar, the saturated fats all take care of itself, and you don't have to remember anything. And whether you pick Mediterranean, Dash, PLADO, doesn't matter. You can have any one of those, and they will all give you a tremendous amount of benefit. Once again, keep in mind that it's all about small steps of change. And those small steps added over time, they lead to a tremendous amount of impact. So start gradually, work with a team, make sure that your team is checking your blood pressure, your labs, and they're staying on top of it. But the final part of this is, self-principle is about sleep, exercise, love, and food. So when we talk about that, don't forget the sleep, don't forget the exercise. Also, don't forget to express gratitude and kindness to others and also to yourself by taking care of your body. I want to thank you guys so much for checking out this video. If you have any questions, drop those in the comments below. I try to read all of them. Uh, Comments and questions, sometimes I'm behind because they get a bit overwhelming. So please forgive me for that. We'll start to have some live episodes coming in soon, so you can have a chance to ask all your questions. But once again, thank you, thank you, thank you for supporting this work, for helping this channel grow. We just got our plaque from YouTube. It's a huge milestone for us. So I'm really grateful for everything. And I'll see everyone next time.